Hey everyone, I'm Casper, and I am a historian with my academic background and focus being on the effects of the Second Industrial Revolution in global history, so about mid-19th to early 20th century, and today, as requested by some of you, I'll be reacting to Oversimplified's video on the Cold War.
The year is 1917. Fighting rages on the Eastern Front of the First World War. Both Germany and Russia are on the brink of collapse.
I find it very interesting, at least in the American curriculum, that not a lot of focus, unfortunately, is paid to the Eastern Front of either the First World War or the Second World War in the European theater. I think some of that is owed due to the fact that America was involved in the Western Front more so than the Eastern Front, but it is definitely a catastrophic thing to examine as any purveyor of history would tell you if they cover it, because the amount of human suffering on the Eastern Front, even for World War One, which is in itself less discussed than the Second World War, is just astronomical. We're talking about a conservative estimate of at least 1 million deaths alone. Of course, the total amount of casualties, which includes wounded as well, have in some estimates exceeded over 6 million. So I'm glad Oversimplified is bringing this up.
Soldier, I need you to bring me this man. Got it. Found him, sir. What? No, not Lenin. Lenin, the Russian communist. What? Why would I need a beetle? Lenin, the Russian communist. He was exiled to Switzerland. You know what? I'll do it myself.
So Lenin wasn't exactly exiled to Switzerland, interestingly enough. He was, I believe, imprisoned for a few years in Russia. I believe he was sent to Siberia for a few years, about 1897, 1898, if I recall correctly. And after his imprisonment, after he served his sentence, he decided to go towards Western Europe, and in order to basically gather sympathy, try to build up a political base outside of Russia so that one day maybe, he could start a revolution either, in Russia or in the host country that he was in. And ultimately he did go with Switzerland, interestingly enough, again. And he did try to have this idea of starting a communist revolution in Switzerland, but the locals weren't very keen on it. He spent some time in Switzerland writing some literature, and eventually he was sent back to Russia, or rather, he went back to Russia.
Who wants to start a revolution?
Regardless of Lenin's intentions, excuse me, Germany and the Central Powers were definitely looking for a way to either end the war faster or to, sabotage the wartime efforts of the Entente. So there's some debate in regards to that, but the fact of the matter is, Lenin did go back to Russia.
Hoping he and his mates would create an internal crisis. And create an internal crisis they did. The government was overthrown, and Lenin was in charge. He immediately pulled out of the First World War, made the country communist, started a 3-year-long civil war, got shot, broke the economy, caused a famine, and then he died. On his
very oversimplified. And, I get the point of the channel, and I like how it presents the information in a simple manner so people can digest it. But I do want to talk about that very fast part of the video. Now, Lenin and his compatriots, the Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, it's a very, very complex thing to look at. The history of the Russian Revolution and the Civil War consequently after that, the different factions, the different motivations, the different kinds of monarchies, nationalists, communists, it's so complex. It could take you decades to even fully study all of it. I think a similar event in the 20th century, or period of time that is just as complex, which a lot of people also don't talk about, interestingly, is the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican Civil War, which I think is as complex as the Russian Revolution and Civil War. So yes, it was a mess. The Mensheviks, who basically are called the minority, even though they were kind of the majority. The Bolsheviks, even though they called themselves the majority, who were kind of minority, had a lot of qualms with one another. And then once the revolution kind of starts, most of them sort of try to make up. But then there's some other problems when Lenin does come back and basically takes back over the Communist Party in Russia from Stalin and the others. And yes, they do pull out of the war, and Russia basically, while it was losing the Eastern Front, there were many reports of desertions, many Russian soldiers leaving at one point from 1915 to 1916. They suffered tremendous losses. They lost parts of Eastern Europe that they had held. Even though Romania had joined the war sometime later, it still didn't really salvage Russia's position. And Lenin was of the opinion, as were many other Russians at the time, that they should not be in this war. This is essentially a war, a fight between the royal families and their cousins, essentially. And of course, the opinions regarding the Tsar of Russia at the time and the monarchy in Russia at the time, despite having sort of presented a gendarme or policeman of Russian reputation for the centuries past, it was faltering. Everyone kind of virtually knew the time of the Tsardom, the time of monarchy in Russia was coming to a close, and Lenin definitely, along with the others, capitalized on the events of the time. So pretty cool that they went over that. Very oversimplified, but I get it. It's very complex.
His deathbed, he said, "Hey man, tell whoever's in charge of giving people jobs not to let that jerk Stalin become the next leader. By the way, who did I put in charge of giving people jobs? That would be Stalin, sir."
This is true. I think it's commonly referred to as Lenin's testament, where he basically kind of did a portrait of each of his compatriots, including Stalin. And interestingly enough, that would be used later by Nikita Khrushchev during the secret speech, where he would basically rail against Stalin, or Stalinism, or the cult of Stalin.
Stalin was a rising force in the Communist Party. He still had some opponents.
He was considered
all of them were arrested or
bully by some of his peers, a brute enforcer.
He implemented his 5-year plans, which transformed the country from an agriculture-based economy to an industrial one. And like Lenin before him, he reigned with terror. Anyone who dared criticize or oppose him would either be killed or left to rot in the horrendous Soviet work camps.
A lot of history, I feel like, comes down to the minor details. One of the reasons why I love history and why I got into the field of history is because of the little details. And a lot of the little details in regards to Russian history, or modern Russian history, has a lot to do with Stalin and how this man acted, or why or how could he have acted this way. I think a wonderful kind of like, maybe controversially colorful portrait of who he was and the close associates of who they were is going to be Stalin, Court of Red Tsar by Montefiore. That's definitely a good read.
Then a short man with a silly mustache tried to take over the world, punched the Russians all the way to Moscow, and then the Russians, with some help from their faithful ally, the Winter, punched them all the way back to Berlin. At this point, being allies, America, the UK, and the Soviet Union were good chums. They held a couple of conferences near the end of the war to decide what would happen next. Hey Stalin, after all your trials and tribulation, you must be pretty happy to be standing here in Berlin. Tsar Alexander made it all the way to Paris.
Nice Napoleonic reference.
Just give me a second. Hey man, I think something's up with Stalin. I know, right? What should we do? Shall I tell him about the bomb?
I love the presentation here. I really do. Okay, so we have Winston Churchill on the left, and I believe Harry Truman on the right here, kind of discussing between themselves, oh my God, the Soviet Union. So I think a lot of historians, or at least my colleagues, would agree with me that the Cold War basically started in the last days of the Second World War. I think, some books or textbooks will tell you, oh, it started maybe 1947 or 1950 with the Korean War. But I genuinely think the Cold War did start in the last days of the Second World War. I think, the video kind of portrays the alliance here, the Allies during World War II as chums, and to an extent, yes, they did support each other. The United States sent a lot of aid to both the British Empire and the Soviet Union. But Winston Churchill, interestingly, was very anti-communist. And I don't know if anyone has seen like Peaky Blinders. It's kind of alluded to in that show how anti-communist or anti-socialist he is. And he sort of regardless of what you think about him as an individual or politician, he did kind of foresee an eventual, what kind of conflict it was, just an eventual conflict with the Soviets. And he actually had drawn up or helped or ordered drawing up, I believe, of Operation Unthinkable, which was essentially a war plan right after World War II ended to go fight the Soviets and to take back Eastern Europe. Because he was afraid of the effects of the Soviet Union on the territories that they had essentially gained during the last day of the Second World War. And a lot of people kind of point to Operation Unthinkable as the reason why Winston Churchill was ousted, as a prime minister. But that's not exactly true. Winston Churchill was ousted because his party and him, the Conservatives, they didn't exactly have a great plan set up for a post-World War II world, right? Like imagine this, you're in Europe or you're in Britain and you're tired of war. It's been a long, long war. A lot of people died. A lot of friends died. You're tired of it. You want peace. You want to know what the heck's going to happen now that the war is over. And the Conservatives and Winston Churchill don't really offer much in place of for a plan for a peaceful world. And you can tell kind of from his view and the plans that they drew up called Operation Unthinkable that they just kept wanting to go into a sort of military conflict. The votes basically got split between the Conservatives, the Labour Party, and there was a third party, and the Labour won. The Labour Party won. And not a lot of people know this as well, but Winston Churchill did eventually get reelected in 1951, although his term then at that point, because of his ailing health, was very ineffective. But so not exactly chums, right? And Harry Truman, on the other hand, I think as time has gone by, a lot of historians and presidential historians have looked at Truman and his administration more and more favorably, partly because the more you look at his administration, the decisions he had to make in regards to, post-World War II world, the Korean War, the takeover of responsibilities in determining, hey, should we drop these atomic bombs on, Japan, in regards to handling the Soviet Union and, communist China. I mean, I don't know if anyone else could have reasonably been like, I can handle all that, right? So Truman definitely had an interesting policy in mind for the Soviet Union and communist countries or communist governments. And it's kind of linked between the Truman Doctrine, which was essentially the urging of, we got to help these non-communist nation states fight back against the communists through, giving them, aid, giving them supplies, weapons, and of course the containment policy, which would sort of flicker on and off depending on the presidential administration that came after the Truman administration. So pretty interesting portrayal here. But I just kind of want to give more context. Forgive my rambling.
Yeah, tell him about the bomb. That will scare him. So, we got this crazy new big A-bomb that can destroy an entire city in one go. Yes, my spies told me already. Oh wait, I meant to act surprised.
This is true.
Wow,
the Soviets
that's amazing. He already
and Stalin knew about the atomic bombs.
Am I sure I want to send nuclear
and this was a very
secrets
significant thing because Truman wanted him to be shocked. Truman wanted him to be surprised.
Dude, use a VPN. And speaking of VPNs,
this is commercial. Through the usage of spies, subterfuge, and infiltration for the Project Manhattan, and subsequently, because so many people were involved, the Soviets already kind of knew, and eventually they would construct their own atomic bombs.
Now, where were we? Oh, yeah. Does the A stand for atomic or ass? Then America dropped their big A-bomb on Japan, and World War II officially came to an
very, very controversial move even today. There was I believe it was Operation, sorry if I'm getting names mixed up at this point, Operation Overlord, I believe it was called. It was a proposal of, in joint efforts with the Russians going from the north side of the archipelago of Japan, and the Americans coming in from the south side of Japan. Land invasions were proposed, and it was estimated that 1 million, according to some analysts, 1 million casualties would have occurred for the Americans in the invasion of Japan, because as they had island hopped and taken over, the various sites and supply routes between Japan and Hawaii, like Iwo Jima, there were just these horrific losses and casualties inflicted on both sides. And a lot of analysts at the time thought, well, if we send in, a land invasion, we're going to see something we haven't seen yet on the other small islands. We're talking about the main land of Japan here. So there will be some arguments made even today that, hey, dropping these atomic bombs on these two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were necessary to preserve both Japanese and American lives. Others will obviously debate on, well, maybe, they could have demonstrated in other ways with atomic bombs without inflicting the very grotesque the effects of, nuclear bombs. So, yeah, a very controversial move.
And hooray, we won. Okay, so now it's time to establish the New World Order. Stalin, you're in charge of Eastern Europe. Now, we want you to let them all hold elections. Oh yes, of course, elections. And these elections will be free and fair, right? Oh yes, certainly, free and fair. Definitely free and fair. Communist, 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 communist. If that's not free and fair, I don't know what is. Throughout Eastern Europe, Soviet puppet governments were established as a buffer zone between the USSR and the West, with Churchill...
Part of this was because Stalin was just... Also, Winston Churchill, the Americans, they were wary of the Soviets. And it's not like it wasn't a two-way street. It's not like the Soviets are dumb. It's not like Stalin was dumb either, or completely unaware of what the capabilities of Western Europe with an America backing them would look like. So he was very paranoid of, another kind of Operation Barbarossa-esque event happening where, the heartland of Russia would be invaded yet again. So he wanted the buffer area between Russia and the rest of Europe, essentially, which was part of the motivations here for the Eastern Bloc.
An Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. The relationship between the old allies was deteriorating fast. Over the next few years, the British intervened in the Greek Civil War to prevent a communist takeover. In Turkey, the Russians
and
began
Truman,
demanding more control.
Truman Doctrine would kick into effect here for both Turkey and Greece.
Sea-Axis routes, which prompted the U.S. to send their largest battleship to Turkey for a friendly visit. After
I believe it was $400 million of aid as well.
The Soviets and the British, with an agreement to both pull out once the war was over. The British pulled out. Stalin was like, you know what? I think I might stick around. All in favor of kicking Russia out of Iran? You want to know something? You guys suck. Pressure from the UN forced the Soviets to leave, and with the establishment of NATO, the Soviets had no doubt that the West was out to encircle and destroy them. And America announced the Truman Doctrine, in which they basically said, those guys are not cool, cannot be trusted, and we will do everything we can to prevent the spread of communism around.
Yes and no. So there were a lot of debates within American circles, within the American political circles, about how to handle the Soviets, how to handle the potential spread of communism. So there were proposals for containment, which is where it's kind of like in between, okay, a full aggression or full pacifism, right? You just kind of want to contain where they drew the lines already and don't let it spread. The other policies kind of proposed were like rolling back, or basically fighting back actively and, sabotaging them, trying to usurp communist regimes, trying to replace communist government heads, and so on, that we would see more of in the 60s and 70s. And then the other one was a form of détente, which is trying to make friendship or economic relations, at least, with the Soviets or with the communists, to sort of try to have a way forward. And Truman sort of settled on containment, as you'll probably have learned from the instance of the Korean War. He was very reluctant to go fully aggressive, and that was part of the disagreements between him and General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War, and part of why he fired Douglas MacArthur under the reason of insubordination, because Douglas MacArthur was of the opinion that they should keep going towards China, which provoked China to sending like 1 million soldiers across the border.
Around the world, many viewed this moment as the official declaration of the Cold War. Back in
Debatable.
Europe, everyone was living in a post-apocalyptic void brought on by the Second World War. Cities reduced to rubble, not enough food.
The Marshall
it
Plan
was
would
terrible.
try to help
This is great.
the
The more they
situation,
suffered, the more likely it
at
is
least
they'll turn
for
to communism. Dude, you're really messed
certain
up. What's
regions.
wrong with you? My father used to punish me severely. America realized what was going on and quickly made a move.
Okay.
Under the Marshall Plan,
Yep.
they sent $12 billion to Western Europe for its economic recovery. The countries of Stalin's Eastern Bloc looked on with envy. Hey, Czechoslovakia, you want to come get some economic aid? Yeah, but I have to check with my mom first. Sorry, America.
Actually accurate here.
This was a
Okay.
full-on economic battle raging between capitalism and communism in Europe. If the Western nations developed faster and better than the East, that would be a defeat for Stalin. So he set up his own rival economic recovery plan, which he called Comecon, and he also set up Common Form, which gave him more political control over the Eastern Bloc. But nowhere did this economic battle rage harder than in the city of Berlin.
In some instances, there
But
was
over 100 miles
resistance.
behind Soviet lines, the city had been divided up between the Allies, and the Western segments were still under Western control. East Berliners could travel freely to West Berlin, see the economic prosperity, and think,
Also not talked about often is like the social impact of a post-World War II society, especially in Germany. You have to understand, I mean, you have to, experts at the time basically said we have to denazify the populace and Germany. And I feel like that part of history is also not talked about often. So, but yeah, I mean, sorry, let's just keep
maybe
going.
this communism thing ain't so great after all. I'm gonna have fun tonight.
Mm-hmm.
You're home late. Oh, Stalin, I was just out with my friends. Friends? You stink of capitalism. You're out engaging in imperialist debauchery again. I swear, Ivan, I can't keep doing this. Stalin wanted the West out. So he said, hey, guess what? I'm blockading all of your supply routes to West Berlin.
Yes.
What are you going to do about it?
They
I
airlifted.
suppose We'll just fly the
Yep.
supplies in.
Things got very tense
All right.
after that.
You in this round. The Berlin airlift was an incredible undertaking and a major success for the Western Allies, and Stalin ended his blockade of West Berlin. His aggressive actions worried the West, but not as much as this did.
Yep. They had
The
their own
Soviet
bomb now.
Union had developed their very own atomic bomb. The USA no longer had a nuclear monopoly. The world now knew that if a major war broke out between the two superpowers, it would be more destructive than anyone could imagine. So it was comforting when Stalin came out and said that war between the Soviet Union and the West was unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait, inevitable. He said it was inevitable. Hey, you know who I haven't checked in on in a while? My good friend China. Whoa, what happened to you? What happened to them was a full-blown civil war, that had
war
been going on
between the
since
Kuomintang and the
1927.
Chinese
People's
Communist
Liberation
Party.
Army, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, successfully defeated the Republic of China, who fled to Taiwan. The now communist China and the Soviet Union signed a mutual defense treaty. This was terrible news for the West. But wait, there's more. After the Second World War, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. In the north,
Yep.
the Soviets set up a communist regime. In the south, America set up an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Korea under their own regime. Now that he had the bomb, Stalin was feeling a little more cocky, and he finally gave Kim permission to attack. The North launched a surprise invasion of the South on June 25th, 1950. With Soviet aid, the North Koreans steamrolled through.
This event is known as Yu-Gi-Oh! In Korea, or South Korea at least. What really interesting here is what happened with Korea that the video kind of skipped over was Korea as a kingdom was annexed by Japan. First, it became a protectorate in 1905. Then in 1910, it became completely annexed and became part of the Japanese Empire in 1910, which added to the Japanese Empire's possessions of Manchuria and parts of Southeast Asia at the time. And eventually, the Russians were beating back the Japanese, and the Americans were coming in, and they sort of just kind of said, "Okay, let's just stop here at this midpoint. Let's not, try to take over each other's gains." And that kind of set the original boundary between the North and South Korean governments. So both of which were established in 1948, I think. Don't quote me on that. And the North Korean government was led by Kim Il-sung, who, despite the legendary myths that the North Korean government propagates today, was, I believe, trained and participated in activities in Russia in his early life. And South Koreans were led by a dictator, as the video says, Lee Seung-min, and he was not the greatest as well, as the video said. So pretty interesting. Just the video kind of skipped over that, but that's okay. They're simplifying
Taking Seoul in just 3 days and replacing one ruthless dictator with another. The UN were freaking out and quickly created an emergency
it was in
force
flux.
from 16 countries to defend the south. The West still held Busan and made landings at Incheon near Seoul. They pushed the North Koreans out of Seoul, replacing the ruthless dictator that had replaced the first ruthless dictator with the same ruthless dictator that had previously been replaced by the new ruthless dictator. And the West then continued all the way up the Korean peninsula. At this point, China was getting worried that the UN may just keep going. The US had sent this guy to lead the operation. After winning the Pacific Theater of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur's head was big and his balls were bigger. He reassured President Truman that there was absolutely no way at all that the Chinese would ever get involved. Meanwhile, 500,000 Chinese troops were crossing into Korea. Nuke them.
Yes. So this is what I was talking about earlier, right? MacArthur was incredibly aggressive and very confident, especially with the Americans also having a nuclear arsenal at this time. And I think, if it weren't for some of his public and very provocative statements that were made at the time, the Chinese probably may not have sent their military across the North Korean border to basically push the UN and South Korean allies to basically the starting point of the war. It was a very bloody war. It's called the Forgotten War in American history, partly because not a lot of Americans remember it or know about it, and that's in some part due to the fact that the Second World War was right before it. So you have this weird period of time of peace between 1945 and 1950, where Americans are going back home, and those who are still enlisted in the service and those who are still in the military have yet another war in the basically remnants of the Pacific theater to fight. And it's just that veterans from that war were never really kind of similar to some of the Vietnam War veterans that returned from Vietnam, were never really properly recognized by the greater American society. It was just something that Americans at the time were exhausted of. They didn't want to talk about that, and that's kind of why it's called the Forgotten War, because it's just not really held to the same standard as the Second World War or even the Vietnam War. So some interesting history there.
No, nuke them. No. Oh, come on. You're fired. The U.S. considered the nuclear
subordination.
But now that the Soviets also had the bomb, they didn't want to risk all-out global destruction. The communists pushed the West right back almost to the exact same spot they had all started from, and they ended up in a
38
stalemate
parallel,
where they remained until both sides finally agreed to work towards a peace settlement in 2018. Back in America,
these peace settlement talks, these talks of reunification for the Koreans have stagnated, or really, I think right now with current events have seen almost no chance of it happening. As time kept going on, the talks of reunification, or even the prospect of reunification, especially reuniting families divided during the Korean War, of course, due to the passage of time, has quickly diminished. I'm not sure if even in our own lifetimes, which I'd be personally surprised by, we'll see a reunification. And reunification also has economic implications involved, especially when we look at the case of the reunification of West and East Germany. So it's hard to say if that'll ever happen, but who knows?
Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected famed World War II General Eisenhower, who is really hard to draw. It's 1953. Hey, Stalin, how you doing? Oh, he's dead.
Yeah, Truman's administration, I mean, they had a lot of tough calls to make, a lot of tough decisions to make, and I don't think any sane president would look at that time period and the decisions they had to make and be like, yeah, that was totally manageable. I think for what it was, Truman did okay. I think it's like the most neutral way to say it. And Eisenhower, interestingly, focused a lot on internal affairs. In fact, he was, if I recall correctly, the president that oversaw the induction of Alaska and Hawaii as official states into the United States. So they were the 49th and 50th states under his administration. He started the construction of the highway system. He created departments of health, a department of education. And he has a lot to his legacy, not just as a president, but also as a commanding general during the Second World War. And interestingly, just a fun fact, he ended up, I think, retiring to a farm, which is near the battlefield of Gettysburg. So pretty interesting president. He also had a lot of things to say. We get the term the military-industrial complex from his parting speech. So just a cool thing to know.
Oh, he's dead. He had a cerebral hemorrhage, and his reign of terror kind of came back to bite him in the ass, because he had imprisoned all of his best doctors, and those that were left were too terrified to treat him. The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, called a meeting and said, hey guys.
That is true. He had a penchant for being very, I honestly, the more you read about him, if you ever do, it's hard to kind of blame him for being extremely paranoid, given the position he was in, the political position he was in, the power position he was in. I think that position alone kind of just pushed him to the brink of insanity at some points, or seeming insanity. So it's interesting. Again, I think I would definitely check out some literature on him, including the Court of the Red Tsar, and I think they're going to talk about the secret speech here with Nikita Khrushchev. So what happened after Stalin died? I mean, people felt brave enough, including Khrushchev, to step up and be like, all right, gather everybody. We're going to talk about how bad Stalin was. Now, the key thing here was not a denunciation of the Communist Party or Lenin's doctrines or anything like that. It was specifically a targeting of Stalin as a leader who could have done more. Stalin as a cult personality, which shouldn't be. The secret speech is called the secret speech in popular terms. I believe the actual speech is called "On the Cult of Stalin and its Effects" or something like that. So Khrushchev made huge waves in this secret speech, the contents of which wasn't released until near the end of the Cold War in 1989, but it was leaked. So his speech was leaked, and it made waves internationally. Albania was affected, where people were like, what the hell? This guy's talking about Stalin being bad. Even North Korea, internally, they were discussing this speech at the time, and that resulted in a internal power struggle between Kim Il-sung and the would-be power grabbers. So this speech is essentially saying Stalin was a pretty bad guy. He didn't do his responsibility correctly. He could have done better. He has his actions led to the suffering of many. And now going forward, we're going to kind of go back to our roots, go back to what Lenin told us. And, he would also bring up the fact that Lenin believed that Stalin was incredibly rude, not a great pick for leadership.
You know how Stalin was in prison?
I would say this speech was more to solidify, not just a path going forward for the Soviet Union, but also Nikita Khrushchev's position himself, right? Because now he's coming into Stalin's position.
And murdering us all for doing basically nothing? Yeah, he was kind of a jerk. I'm really not sure how this is news to you. Khrushchev went on a campaign of de-Stalinization.
Right.
Statues of Stalin were taken down, Stalingrad was renamed, and Khrushchev announced that he wanted the Soviet people to be happy and would allow greater freedom in the Soviet Union. So how did that work out? Well, an uprising in East Germany was brutally suppressed, a revolution in Hungary was brutally suppressed, and demonstrations in
Huge
Poland were
international
brutally suppressed,
ramifications.
although he did finally allow some mild reforms. Back in the Soviet Union, he permitted more cultural expression, but then began banning stuff based on his own personal taste. Modern art looks like a child urinated on a canvas. Banned. Jazz music sounds like the feeling of needing to fart. Banned. Your poetry is really depressing. How could anyone in the Soviet Union be depressed? You're banned. Khrushchev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but not like that. Or that. Or that. Young people began enjoying abhorrent Western pop culture. Son, remove that disgusting imperialist apparel at once. Shut up, Dad. You can't tell me what to do. Well, would you look at that? Turns out he can tell me what to do. The West had initially liked the cut of Khrushchev's jib, but world events soon soured relations even more. The two sides were spying on each other a whole lot throughout the Cold War. The KGB had spies and informants in nearly every aspect of Western life and government, so much so that whenever the US tried to send spies into the Soviet Union, the KGB were usually ready to arrest them on the spot. Members of the Manhattan Project aided the Soviet Union in acquiring the bomb. Some American officials believed they were on the wrong side. I'll sell you 3 secrets for $5 million. Okay. Go ahead. The Allies are digging a tunnel under East Berlin to tap your communications. There's an American agent living at this address in Moscow, and sometimes, when I'm home alone, I like to put on my wife's dresses, sit in the corner, and cry for hours.
I don't know about the last part.
In America,
Okay.
fear took hold during the Red Scare and the McCarthy trials.
Oh,
American values
man.
imploded as fear of communism collided with freedom of thought and expression.
The period of McCarthyism was definitely a very rough one for the Americans at the time. You had prominent writers, even figures from Hollywood, basically forced to testify between HUAC or HUAC, House of Un-American Committee. House of Un-American Activities Committee. It was most of it was definitely a scare. Like, of course, there were valid concerns, there were valid security concerns, but a lot of it was definitely used by McCarthy to have to consolidate personal political power and to also, of course, have public scapegoats. So that's a it's actually not the only red scare in American history, but.
And communist kind of became a buzzword thrown around to describe anything.
It still is a buzzword
Hollywood,
today.
Communist.
Yep.
Your next door neighbor's dog? Communist. When the grocery store cashier asks if you need a bag when you clearly can't carry 10 tubs of baconaise in your hands? Communist. But one area in particular where the US had an edge over the Soviet Union.
I think it was Upton Sinclair who made the remark after running for public office that Americans are more than willing to support a candidate who promises support and aid, funding to the people. But the moment you say it's socialism or whatever, then your career is over. So it's still used as a buzzword today. So it's pretty interesting that we can just kind of look at the past 100 or so years and be like, that's where it comes from. And that's part of the reason why I'm so invested and why I chose the period of time that I chose, the Second Industrial Revolution, from about 1860s, 50s to about 1920s, 30s, because so much of what we see today, conflicts in the Middle East, conflicts all over the world, certain boundaries on the map, certain political ramifications we have to deal with today, even kind of like everyday life with highways and freeways and how certain neighborhoods are set up. All these things, every facet of life today, almost every facet of life today, is connected to that period of time. So it's pretty cool.
And its espionage technology.
And a little
in
depressing
particular,
sometimes.
U-2 spy planes flew across Russia carrying out surveillance from the skies. There was a nasty incident in 1960 though, when one was shot down and Khrushchev was furious. Who the hell is this? He's a high-altitude weather enthusiast who flew off course. Okay, that sounds plausible. Wait a minute. Why does he have a gun and a poison needle? Because he's a very naughty high-altitude weather enthusiast. But much to
there were so many close calls throughout the period of the Cold War that at least we know about that could have led to potential nuclear Armageddon. And you just have to be really thankful, really, when you look back at the history of it and be like, man, we didn't just dodge a bullet. We dodged the entire, you know, spraying of a gun.
America's concern, the Soviet Union appeared to be ahead in the space race. Everyone freaked out when Russia launched the world's first
Sputnik.
satellite, and then they actually sent a man into space. Even worse,
Not
there
with a
also appeared
catapult.
to be a missile gap in the Soviets' favor.
That'd be impressive.
Khrushchev was so confident that he even allowed the US to set up a technology exhibit in Moscow, attended by a certain vice president.
Lots of
Richard
posturing.
Nixon. Check this out. We have color TV. Yes, but we've been to space and can obliterate you with our massive nuclear arsenal. Check out this vegetable peeler. Tensions increased further when both sides upgraded their atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs.
It just kept going. You know, if you look at the atoll, right, testing sites, the bombs just kept getting bigger and bigger up until the point where some scientists believed that if they went bigger and tested it, it could lead to really, really bad results or fallout. So it just kept going. The arms race was a terrifying thing at the time, and the public kind of knew about it and were told, duck behind the desk or take cover under a desk, kids, when you hear a nuclear bomb warning or siren in the air. Another thing that isn't really talked about too, especially for the American side, is the effects of the testing on American soldiers. There were reassurances at the time from military brass, and I forget there was a specific lieutenant colonel or somebody who assured Congress and other groups that nuclear fallout wasn't bad and the soldiers will be fine. But a lot of soldiers got sick, and to this day, I don't think it's been truly officially recognized. Compensation was never really given, so that's just an unfortunate piece of history that not a lot of people again know about.
And after West Germany was allowed to join NATO in 1955, Khrushchev set up the Defensive Warsaw Pact, strengthening the military ties between the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In 1960, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected John F. Kennedy. The Soviet Union was advancing its technology, but it was also bleeding its coffers dry, and all of the money was going towards the military, not the people. Life under communism was still as hard as ever, and Berlin remained a thorn in the Soviet side. The contrast between the economically prosperous West and the struggling East was clearer day by day, and East Berliners were still able to freely travel to the West. Now, many of them were deciding to stay there. Millions defected to West Germany via West Berlin, causing Eastern factories to lose workers and taking a heavy toll on the economy. Soviet leaders decided this couldn't continue any longer. First, Khrushchev tried this: leave West Berlin, or else. Or else what? Or else I'll be really mad at you. Yeah, no, we're gonna stay. Listen, man, West Berlin is ours, East Berlin is yours. That's just how it is. Kennedy felt pretty good about his show of American resolve.
Pretty good drawing for Kennedy.
Did you catch that? Let's replay it.
East Berlin is yours.
Uh-oh, Kennedy just told Khrushchev that the USA wouldn't interfere in what the Soviets did with their section of Berlin, so Khrushchev came up with a new idea. We're gonna build a wall, and it's gonna be a big, beautiful wall.
Berlin
It's
Wall.
gonna keep out all the Mexicans. Just say that's wrong, it's gonna keep
Oh, no.
Sorry, it's gonna keep in all the Mexicans.
Okay.
On August 13th, 1961, Berliners woke up to find their city divided into two, with barbed wire and guards blocking the border between East and West. Over time, a wall was constructed throughout the city. Families were torn apart. Thousands would risk their lives escaping over the wall, and hundreds
And a lot of people would die.
To the despair of Berliners, the West were unable to do anything about it, but the wall did put on full display the failure of the communist system. As Kennedy said, democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. As part of the agreement between the two sides, US diplomats were still allowed to travel to East Berlin, but suddenly, East Berlin crossing guards started giving them the business, and Kennedy was like, nah-uh. In October, the US rolled tanks up to the crossing point at Checkpoint Charlie as a show of strength. The Soviets did the same, and the two were in a standoff. They stayed like that for 16 hours, and the world braced for nuclear Armageddon. Thankfully, though, Kennedy called Khrushchev directly and was like, hey,
There was a lot of
this is getting way
brinksmanship
too hot. How about you
and
back your tanks up by an inch and
de-escalation,
we'll do the same?
oftentimes
Sounds good. Okay,
to
how about you back your tanks up by
bring
another
the other
inch
side
and
to
we'll
the
follow suit?
table,
All
if
right,
possible.
okay, you wanna do
Although
another
there were
inch? And they both
points
very slowly inched away from the
at which
apocalypse.
either
Hey,
side
let's
kind
hope
of felt
that's the
like
biggest crisis of
this
my
could
presidency.
really go bad.
It wasn't.
And thankfully it didn't go bad. Oh, that was a pretty good video. Of course, just because of the nature of the video, because they're oversimplifying it they couldn't get into the nitty gritty. And that's kind of why I'm making this video, I guess, for some of you who requested it. So yeah, pretty cool. I will probably react to part 2. So make sure to subscribe to the channel and keep up. And if you guys have anything else you want me to react to as a historian, let me know. And down in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time.